thank you all very much for including me in this event. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I also would like to kind of extend my thanks to Maurice, who is a phenomenon. He is remarkable and extraordinary and brilliant. And I think that what he's doing in relation to these events and also his general legal work should be copied across the globe. But what I've said to Maurice I would do, is just talk briefly about how religion fits into the whole human rights framework and the international human rights law framework, and just spend 10 minutes, maybe less, just looking at the way in which international courts and tribunals approach the whole question of that kind of conflict of rights between what we would say is sort of sexual orientation and gender identity and your right to manifest your religion and belief. And it won't surprise you to know that the international human rights law world has dealt with this issue quite extensively and has really tried to grapple with some key questions. The first point I think I should make is that the state is required to be neutral in these discussions between faith and identity, and probably the questions that the human rights that most engage that notion of identity, sexual identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, is the notion of the right to respect for private life. Most often you see that right in competition, or apparently in competition, with the right to manifest your religion and belief. But and many of the cases that I'm going to very quickly look at come from the European Court of Human Rights, but the principles that they enunciate are principles that are shared across the globe in relation to international human rights law. And just to make it clear, the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has categorically said that to criminalize people simply on the basis of their sexual orientation violates that covenant. I think every single jurisdiction that is involved in this event today is a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And so there is a de facto violation of the ICCPR, the International Covenant, in those jurisdictions that continue to criminalize. So it's very clear at that level at the UN, but you've also had the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights point out that that states must ensure that a person's sexual orientation is not a barrier to realizing their economic and social and cultural rights. The Convention on the Rights of the Child has made it very clear that it prohibits discrimination against LGBT plus people. So has the Convention Against Torture. But from America's perspective, of course, you've got your own inter-American system of human rights protection, which is now the most forward-thinking, the most advanced, the most comprehensive framework of rights for the LGBT plus community anywhere in the world. But when we're looking at that idea of competing rights, I think the important thing to emphasize when we're looking at faith and the relationship that faith has with sexual orientation and gender identity is that the right to manifest the right to religion in international human rights law falls into three component parts. There's the right to hold a belief, and your right to hold that belief is an absolute right. The state has no role in interfering with it. Nobody can interfere with your right to hold a belief system. When you manifest your belief or your faith, then the state can justify interferences with the way in which you manifest your religion and belief. And the other important thing about the right to faith in international human rights law, it's a collective right. So churches, faith groups, mosques, synagogues, they have a collective right to worship together. And that is important. But there's a constant search for balance in all of this. And so when we're looking at the relationship between what would be private life, i.e. your rights to your identity and your autonomy, and your so-called conflict with faith, then the question would be, what's it really doing to your right to manifest your religion and belief? If somehow imposing LGBT identity on a faith meant that that faith could no longer function, that would be a prima facie violation of that faith. And I think maybe it's best, I mean, you may be familiar with all these sort of gay cake cases that have been floating around the world. I think the best way of looking at that from my point of view, so I'm giving you my personal opinion on all of this, is that if I turn up at a church's cake sale, and I turn up with my gay cake, my cake saying support gay rights or LGBT rights rule or whatever my cake may be, saying, I think that faith, the faith community holding the bake sale could ask me to take my cake away. And I don't think that would be an unlawful interference with my private life rights, my LGBT rights. But if there's a sort of blanket, they can, I'm on the high street and I wish to eat my cake or get my cake iced, that's another story altogether. And there's a case currently before the European Court of Human Rights involving the United Kingdom, where a man was denied icing on his cake, so to speak, where he argued that he should be entitled to, say, support gay marriage, and the baker refused to ice his cake. So let's see how all that plays out at the European Court of Human Rights. But the basic presumption is your faith can be interfered with in order for a general public good. And the general public good is obviously a world where everyone's human dignity is recognized. And as long as that recognition of everyone's human dignity, i.e. LGBT people's human dignity, doesn't undermine your ability to manifest your faith, then your faith can be lawfully interfered with, despite the fact that it may offend your faith to have to perform civil partnerships, marriages of same-sex couples. The public good in relation to that, to people's right to marry or to have a civil partnership, will outweigh the individual's right who complains that to require them to marry someone of the same sex is an interference with their right to manifest their faith and their religion. And so we see actually that faith is, although it's very broadly protected as what is a faith, when it comes to what is a manifestation of a faith and when you can lawfully interfere with it, it turns out that faith is not that well protected. And so, for example, in a case against France, the fact that it was possible for a Jewish community to get kosher meat from Belgium, and the fact that the place they got it in France was closed down by the state, that did not mean that meant that their faith rights were still being protected because they had access to kosher meat somewhere, and it wasn't unreasonable for them to get it from Belgium, and so therefore the state had not acted unlawfully by closing down the particular place that provided kosher meat before. And similarly, if you look at the case against Turkey, the headscarf cases, Layla Shahid wanted to wear a headscarf while she was at university, and the university said no. The university is a place of faith neutrality, and therefore everyone must appear neutral when they're on university premises. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, that Layla Shahid had every right to wear her headscarf when she was off the university premises. And so therefore the question is, how serious was that interference with her ability to manifest her belief? Well, it wasn't that serious. It was a temporary moment when she was in the university environment. And the Turkish authorities, they would probably argue it differently now, could justify why they were doing it in order to maintain that notion of neutrality in public space in Turkey. And so when you look at those faith cases at the European Court of Human Rights in particular, you find that faith isn't that protected when it's being manifested, as long as the right isn't being fundamentally undermined in and of itself. And of course, as we must acknowledge, there is a broad margin of appreciation. But so there's lots of interesting issues to discuss looking at faith and human rights. And I've just given you literally the tip of the iceberg. And hopefully when Maurice does this event again, you might ask me back again and I can delve into these issues in a little more depth. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? Here in the Caribbean, Western jurisprudence, well, it's down the runway, but it hasn't taken off. These nice questions of law simply don't arise here, except in very, very rare cases indeed.
Well, it is why, the work that Maurice does is so extraordinary, and what Jason Jones did in Trinidad and Tobago is so remarkable. And the fact that they put themselves out there like that, it just takes my breath away about how brave they are. But I think in the situation that where you are in the Caribbean, seeking to assert your rights through the courts is probably the only way it's going to really happen, I think. And I was talking to Maurice the other day, and I think we just realised that we've met probably 8 years ago. I think it was, wasn't it, Maurice, or something like that. And other than what Jason Jones did, sort of randomly. I mean, it wasn't random. He obviously thought about it strategically, but other than nothing has changed. Nothing has changed in 8 years. And I remember hearing from Michael Kirby, where he was being quite critical of situations. Michael Kirby's an eminent jurist from Australia. And he was, it's all very well and good saying we will wait. How long are you going to wait? And obviously, as Jason Jones announced, he was a man in his mid-50s and felt utterly demeaned and degraded by the fact that he was criminalized when he was at home in Trinidad. So he pursued the litigation, and as we know, he won. So it's very difficult, but I think it is. I very much am in awe of Maurice's litigation strategies, and all credit to him. And we need to do all we can to support him in them.
Yeah, yes, indeed, Maurice. You know how much I think of you. I think you. Weren't you my pupil, Maurice? I think you were. Yeah, he's great. And is that a yes, Maurice?
Sadly, we passed each other because you taught criminal law in Barbados. I did criminal law.
Yes, you would have done it in Jamaica. Yes,
right. But I certainly saw you on campus when I came to Barbados to do my last 2 years.
Yes, you wouldn't have missed the orange car. That's for certain. Yes. So thank you, Jonathan. And it was nice to have a response to what I was saying, actually. And I'm very glad that you mentioned Maurice because, he's wonderful. Yeah. Good. Well, now that finishes the panelists. We now have a question and answer session, I expect. And so at this point, I hand it back to Maurice.